The water was rising faster than anyone had predicted. As James Bennett struggled against the current, his boots sinking into the mud, he could see the woman's terrified face through the rain-streaked windshield of her expensive car. The floodwaters had already reached her door handles. Another foot, and she'd be swept away entirely. James had exactly one chance to save her life, but what he didn't know was that this single act of courage would transform his failing farm, his family's future, and spark a nationwide conversation about the forgotten bass. Heartland of America. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Tomorrow's story will be even more incredible, so you won't want to miss it. Rain pelted the tin roof of James Bennett's farmhouse with a ferocity that had kept him awake most of the night. By dawn, water had begun pooling in the lowest sections of his fields, threatening this season's crops that were already struggling after 3 years of disappointing harvests. His grandfather's once prosperous 200 acres had dwindled to just 70 over the decades, and even those remaining acres seemed determined to slip through James's fingers despite his best efforts. At 42, James had the weathered appearance of someone a decade older. His hands were calloused, face lined from years squinting against the sun, and shoulders permanently stooped from endless physical labor. The farm had been passed down through 4 generations of Bennetts, but it seemed increasingly likely it wouldn't survive to a 5th. Between the bank loans, equipment repairs, and changing climate patterns, James found himself scrambling just to break even each season. "Dad, the creek's overflowing," his 17-year-old daughter Lily said, appearing in the doorway of the kitchen where James sat reviewing their diminishing finances. She had her mother's delicate features, but James's stubborn determination. Since Sarah had passed away 5 years ago from cancer, Lily had become his partner in keeping the farm afloat while balancing her school responsibilities. James stood and peered out the window. The sky was an ominous dark gray, and the normally placid creek that cut through the eastern edge of their property had transformed into a churning brown torrent. "The Weather Service just upgraded the alert," Lily continued, holding up her phone. "Flash flood warning for the entire county. They're saying it could be the worst flooding since '97. James remembered that flood all too well. He'd been just a teenager when the waters rose so quickly they lost half their livestock overnight. His father had never quite recovered from the financial blow. "We should move the tractor and remaining equipment to the high ground by the barn," James said, already reaching for his rain gear. "And make sure the emergency kits are ready, in case we need to evacuate." Lily nodded and set to work, while James pulled on his boots and weatherproof jacket. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands as he stepped outside. The rain struck his face like tiny needles, and the roar of the downpour made it almost impossible to hear anything else. For the next 2 hours, James and Lily worked frantically to secure what they could. They moved equipment to higher ground, reinforced the emergency sandbagging around the house foundation, and relocated their few remaining animals, 3 dairy cows and a dozen chickens, to safer shelters. By mid-afternoon, the local emergency management system sent an alert recommending evacuation for properties along the creek. James studied the swollen waterway from his porch and made a difficult decision. "Lily, I want you to take the truck and head to Uncle Frank's place in town," he said, handing her the keys. "What about you?" she asked, concern etching her young face. "I'll stay and keep working on the drainage. If it gets worse, I'll follow in the old pickup." "Dad, that's ridiculous. Come with me now. Someone needs to try to divert the water from the west fields. If we lose this crop, too." Pot. The unspoken reality hung between them. Another failed harvest would mean the end of Bennett Farm. "I'll be fine," James assured her. "Frank's place is on high ground. I'll call you every hour, and at the first sign of real danger, I'll head out." After much protestation, Lily reluctantly departed, leaving James to continue his battle against the elements. The rain showed no signs of abating as afternoon stretched into early evening. James worked methodically, digging channels to redirect water away from his most vulnerable crops, pausing only occasionally to catch his breath or respond to Lily's concerned text messages. It was during one such break, as James stood under the partial shelter of an old oak tree, that he first heard it, a sound so incongruous amid the storm that at first he thought he'd imagined it. But There it was again. A car horn, persistent and desperate, coming from the direction of Willow Creek Road that ran alongside his eastern property. James didn't hesitate. He splashed through ankle-deep water toward the sound, fighting against the strengthening current as he approached the road. What he saw made his heart drop. Willow Creek Road had transformed into a fast-flowing stream, and trapped in the middle was a sleek silver luxury SUV, its headlights cutting weakly through the downpour. The water had already reached halfway up the vehicle's doors and was rising visibly with each passing minute. Inside, a woman was frantically honking the horn and trying to open her window, which appeared to be electrically operated and malfunctioning. The vehicle shifted slightly in the current, a warning that it wouldn't remain stable for long. James scanned the area quickly. The strongest current was coming from the north, where the creek had jumped its banks entirely. He needed to approach from the downstream side to avoid being swept away himself. Grabbing a length of rope from his belt, he'd been using it to secure tarps earlier. James waded carefully into the floodwaters. The force of the current surprised him immediately. What looked manageable from the shore was actually a powerful flow, capable of knocking a grown man off his feet. James leaned into the force, placing each step deliberately, testing his footing before committing his weight. The cold water quickly soaked through his jeans, making movement even more difficult. By the time he reached the vehicle, the water had risen another few inches. Through the window, he could see the woman's face clearly, now early 30s perhaps, with dark hair plastered against her head, eyes wide with terror. She wore a professional-looking blouse, completely inappropriate for the rural back roads of Heartland County, especially during flood conditions. A city person, James guessed, probably following her GPS on a shortcut that had turned deadly in the storm. James signaled for her to roll down the window, but she pointed frantically at the controls and shook her head. The car's electrical system must have shorted out. Looking around, James spotted a heavy branch that had washed up against the guardrail. He retrieved it and, with a silent apology to the vehicle's owner, smashed the passenger side window. The woman shrieked as glass shattered inward, but James was already clearing the remaining shards from the frame. "You need to come out now," he shouted over the roar of the water and rain. "The car could be swept away any minute." "I can't swim well," she called back, clutching the steering wheel as if it might save her. "I've got you," James promised, reaching both arms through the window. "But we have to go now." The woman hesitated only briefly before unbuckling her seatbelt and maneuvering toward the passenger window. As she did, the car shifted again, this time rotating several degrees before catching on something unseen beneath the surface. Water began pouring in through the broken window. "Now," James urged, his arms extended into the vehicle. She moved quickly then, allowing James to grip her under her arms and haul her through the window. She was lighter than he expected, but the awkward angle and slippery conditions made the extraction difficult. For one heart-stopping moment, she became stuck, her expensive belt caught on something inside. James braced himself against the vehicle's frame and pulled harder, feeling the fabric tear as she finally came free. No sooner had he pulled her clear of the window than the SUV groaned metallically and began to move. The unseen anchor below had given way, and the vehicle was now at the mercy of the current. James tightened his grip on the woman and began the difficult journey back to shore, fighting not only the strengthening flow, but also the challenge of supporting another person. They were only halfway to safety when James felt his footing give way. In an instant, both he and the woman were submerged, the cold water closing over their heads. James kept his grip on her with one hand while desperately reaching out with the other, searching for anything to arrest their movement. His fingers scraped against something solid, the partially submerged fence that marked the boundary of his property. With a surge of effort, James grabbed the wooden post and pulled them both toward it, managing to get their heads above water. The woman was coughing and sputtering but conscious. "Hold on to this," James shouted, guiding her hands to the fence post. "I'm going to tie us to it." With practiced movements, James secured the rope around both the post and the woman's waist, creating a lifeline that would prevent her from being swept away even if she lost her grip. Only then did he take a moment to assess their situation. The current was still strengthening, the rain showing no sign of letting up. They couldn't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, The fence might give way, or the water might rise above their heads. James's farmhouse was closer than any other structure, perhaps 300 yards across his flooded eastern field. "We need to move to higher ground," he called to the woman, who nodded through chattering teeth. "My farm is just over there. We'll use the fence line as a guide and handhold. Stay connected to the rope." For the next 20 minutes, they engaged in a grueling journey, moving post by post along the fence line. The woman, despite her obvious fear and physical discomfort, showed remarkable resilience, following James's instructions without question and pushing forward when many might have given up. Finally, they reached the relative safety of James's sloping driveway, where the water was only ankle-deep. By the time they staggered onto the porch, both were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and shivering violently. Inside, James immediately grabbed blankets from the linen closet and handed one to the woman. "The power's still on, surprisingly," he said, turning up the thermostat. "Bathroom's down the hall if you want to change. I can lend you some of my daughter's clothes." "Thank you," the woman managed through chattering teeth. "I don't even know your name." "James Bennett," he replied, suddenly self-conscious of his modest farmhouse, with its worn furniture and outdated kitchen. "James, I'm Victoria Reeves," she said, extending a trembling hand. The name tickled something in the back of James's mind, but he couldn't place it. He shook her hand briefly. "Let's get you warmed up, Ms. Reeves, then we can figure out next steps." While Victoria changed in the bathroom, James quickly did the same in his bedroom, replacing his soaked clothes with dry jeans and a flannel shirt. He then set about making hot coffee and checking the latest weather alerts on his phone. The news wasn't good. The entire county was now under emergency conditions, with several roads completely washed out and rescue operations underway in the neighboring town of Millfield. When Victoria emerged wearing a pair of Lily sweatpants and one of her hooded sweatshirts, James handed her a steaming mug. "Roads are completely cut off," he informed her. "Looks like you're stuck here until the waters recede or emergency services can reach us." Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "I should have listened to the warnings," she said. "I was trying to get back to Louisville after a canceled interview in Heartland. My producer kept calling, telling me to find shelter, but I thought I could outrun the storm." She shook her head. "Stupid decision. I almost got both of us killed." "You're not from around here," James observed. "Most locals know not to underestimate our flash floods." "No, I'm based out of Chicago," Victoria said. She studied him for a moment, seeming to make a decision. "Mr. Bennett, do you ever watch American Heartland? It's a news magazine show on NCN." James shrugged. "Don't have much time for TV these days." "I'm the host," she said simply. "We travel the country doing feature stories on American life outside the major cities. I was in Kentucky researching potential segments when the storm hit." Now James understood why her name had seemed familiar. While he rarely watched television, he'd seen promotional materials for the show at his doctor's office, and occasionally caught glimpses when Lily was watching. American Heartland was apparently quite popular, focusing on human interest stories from rural and small-town America. "Well, Ms. Reeves," James said, feeling even more conscious of his humble surroundings, "I'm afraid Bennett Farm isn't much of a shelter during a flood, but it's better than your car. The guest room is made up if it comes to spending the night." Victoria wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "You saved my life out there. I don't know how to thank you." James waved away her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Victoria said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and waited for professionals. You risked your life wading into that current." James felt uncomfortable with her praise. "Speaking of, I need to call my daughter to let her know I'm okay." After reassuring Lily that he was safe and had a stranded motorist taking shelter at the house, James checked the perimeter of the property. The waters were still rising, but his house sat on the slight elevation that had so far kept the worst of the flooding at bay. The same couldn't be said for his fields, which were now completely submerged in many areas. When he returned inside, Victoria was studying the family photos on the living room wall. "Your daughter?" she asked, pointing to a recent picture of Lily at her junior prom. Yes, that's Lily, James confirmed. She's 17, finishing high school next year. Victoria nodded toward another photo, this one showing a younger James with his arm around a pretty woman with Lily's delicate features. And her mother? Sarah, James said softly. She passed away 5 years ago, pancreatic cancer. I'm so sorry, Victoria said, genuine sympathy in her voice. You've been running the farm and raising your daughter alone since then? James nodded, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. It's been challenging, but Lily's a big help. She loves this place as much as I do. Victoria's gaze traveled over the other photos, images of the farm in better days, of James's parents and grandparents standing proudly before abundant harvests. This farm has been in your family a long time? 4 generations, James confirmed. Though I'm not sure there will be a 5th. These last few years have been tough on small farms like ours. Victoria seemed about to ask another question when a loud crash from outside interrupted them. James rushed to the window to see that part of the old oak tree near the driveway had split, its massive branch now blocking access to the road. Not that the flooded road was passable anyway. Looks like you're definitely staying the night, James observed. Let me check our emergency supplies. As the evening progressed, the storm's fury finally began to abate, though the floodwaters remained high. James prepared a simple dinner from his pantry store's canned soup and homemade bread that Lily had baked the previous day. Throughout the meal, Victoria asked thoughtful questions about farming life, the challenges of agricultural work in changing climate conditions, and the economic pressures faced by small farmers. James found himself opening up more than he usually would with a stranger. There was something about Victoria that inspired trusted genuine interest in his answers and a lack of judgment about his circumstances. Perhaps it was her professional training as a journalist, or maybe just her natural empathy, but James found himself sharing details about the farm's financial struggles that he rarely discussed with anyone but Krat. Lily. 3 bad seasons in a row, he explained as they sat at the kitchen table. First year, it was too dry. Next year, pests destroyed half the crop before we could treat them, couldn't afford the pesticides up front. This year, we had a good start, but now, he gestured toward the window and the flooded fields beyond. What will you do? Victoria asked. James stared into his coffee cup. What I've always done. Pick up the pieces and try again. But the bank won't extend our loans much further. We might have to sell some acreage, which means less production next year. A vicious cycle, Victoria Bash observed. The story of small farming in America, James agreed. My great-grandfather worked 200 acres. I'm down to 70, and barely holding on to those. They talked well into the night, the conversation eventually shifting to lighter topics, Lily's college aspirations, the community's resilience during previous disasters, and even Victoria's experiences traveling Bopras, the country for her show. By the time they retired to their respective rooms, James felt as if he'd known her much longer than a single evening. Morning brought watery sunshine and receding floodwaters. James rose early, as was his habit, and found Victoria already awake, standing on the porch surveying the damage to the property. It's bad, isn't it? She asked as he joined her. James nodded grimly. The western fields, his best hope for this season's harvest, were still underwater, the young plants completely submerged. Even if the water receded quickly, the crop would be lost. The eastern fields, which had been fallow this season, were in even worse condition, with evidence of significant soil erosion. I'm so sorry, Victoria said quietly. James squared his shoulders. Part of farming life. We'll figure something out. They ate breakfast, and by mid-morning, emergency services had cleared enough roads that Victoria was able to arrange for a colleague to pick her up. As they waited for her ride, she handed James her business card. I want to thank you properly for saving my life, she said. Please stay in touch. James pocketed the card, certain he would never use it. No thanks necessary, just glad you're safe. When a news van pulled up his driveway instead of the regular car he'd expected, James raised an eyebrow. Sorry, Victoria said with a small smile. It was the only vehicle available. My producer was worried sick. A man with a camera stepped out, along with a woman carrying sound equipment, both looking relieved to see Victoria. They embraced her briefly, before loading her bag into the van. Before leaving, Victoria turned to James once more. "Thank you again, James Bennett. I won't forget what you did." As the news van disappeared down the road, James returned to the monumental task of assessing and mitigating the flood damage. He put Victoria Reeves and her television show out of his mind. He had more pressing concerns than a brief encounter with a celebrity journalist. The next 3 weeks were among the most difficult of James's life. The flood had indeed destroyed most of this season's plantings, leaving him with difficult decisions about whether to attempt a late-season crop with fast-growing varieties or to accept the loss and focus on preparation for next spring. After consulting with agricultural extension agents and running the numbers repeatedly, James reluctantly concluded that he couldn't afford the investment required for replanting. "We'll get through this," he assured Lily as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing their options. "We still have the dairy production, and I can pick up extra work at the Wilson place through harvest season." Lily looked unconvinced. "Dad, maybe it's time to consider selling some acreage. Just enough to get us through until next season." James shook his head firmly. "Every acre we sell is one we'll never get back. Your great-grandfather built this place from nothing. I won't be the one to dismantle it piece by piece." The argument one they'd had in various forms over recent months was interrupted by the ringing of James's phone. The number was unfamiliar, with a Chicago area code. "Mr. Bennett? This is Victoria Reeves." James was genuinely surprised. 3 weeks had passed since the flood, and while he'd thought about their encounter occasionally, he hadn't expected to hear from her again. "Ms. Reeves, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. I'm calling because I have a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear it." James listened as Victoria explained that since returning to Chicago, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about his story, the generational farmer fighting against economic pressures, climate challenges, and personal tragedy to preserve his family's legacy. "It's exactly the kind of story American Heartland was created to tell," Victoria said. "With your permission, I'd like to bring a crew to your farm and feature you in an upcoming episode." James's initial reaction was refusal. He was an intensely private person who had never sought attention or sympathy. But Victoria continued before he could respond. "Before you say no, and I suspect that's what you're about to do, please consider this. Our featured stories often generate significant support for their subjects. Previous segments have resulted in community fundraising, business partnerships, and even corporate sponsorships. I'm not promising anything specific, but the visibility could open doors for Bennett Farm." End quote. James thought about the stack of bills on his desk, the latest letter from the bank, and Lily's college fund, which had remained stagnant for the past 3 years. "I need to think about it," he said finally, "and discuss it with my daughter." "Of course," Victoria agreed. "Take all the time you need. But James, this could make a real difference." After hanging up, James sat quietly processing the unexpected opportunity. His instinct was still to decline. He disliked the idea of putting his struggles on display, of appearing to ask for help. But when he discussed it with Lily that evening, her perspective gave him pause. "Dad, it's not about pride," she insisted. "It's about the farm's survival. If this could help us keep Bennett Farm going, how can you not consider it?" James looked at his daughter, seeing in her the same determination that had characterized generations of Bennetts before her. "You really think it's worth trying?" he asked. "I think Grandpa and Great-Grandpa would have done whatever it took to save this place," Lily answered simply, including swallowing a little pride. 2 days later, James called Victoria back and agreed to the feature. What followed was a whirlwind of activity as Victoria and her production team descended upon Bennett Farm. The crew consisted of camera operators, sound technicians, lighting specialists, and production assistants, all working under Victoria's precise direction. For 5 days, they filmed every aspect of James's daily life. His pre-dawn routines, the endless maintenance of aging equipment, his interactions with local suppliers and neighboring farmers, and quiet evenings with Lily. They captured his careful record-keeping, his thoughtful land management practices, and the innovative water conservation systems he'd developed despite limited resources. Throughout it all, Victoria conducted in-depth interviews, drawing out James's knowledge, passion, and concerns in a way that no one ever had before. She was particularly skilled at making him forget the cameras were rolling, creating conversations that felt intimate and genuine despite the technical apparatus surrounding them. "How do you keep going?" she asked during one such session, as they sat on his porch overlooking fields that should have been lush with crops, but now lay barren after the flood. James considered the question carefully. "Farming isn't just what I do," he finally said. "It's who I am. My family has worked this land through world wars, the Great Depression, previous floods, and droughts. Every generation faces its challenges. These are mine. But at what point does perseverance become impractical?" Victoria pressed gently. "When do the economic realities outweigh the emotional connection? That's the question I ask myself every morning," James admitted. "So far, the answer has been to keep fighting, to find new approaches, to adapt. My grandfather used to say that farmers are the original innovators we have to be, or we don't survive." The most difficult interviews concerned Sarah's illness and passing, and how it had affected both the farm operations and James's relationship with Lily. Victoria handled these discussions with remarkable sensitivity, knowing when to probe deeper and when to allow silence to speak for itself. By the final day of filming, James had developed a newfound respect for the work Victoria and her team did. What appeared effortless and spontaneous on television was, he now understood, the result of meticulous planning, technical expertise, and genuine human connection. As the crew packed up their equipment, Victoria joined James for a final conversation away from the cameras. "The episode will air in 3 weeks," she informed him. "I'd like to fly you and Lily to Chicago for the premiere. The network will cover all expenses." James hesitated. "I appreciate the offer, but the farm. Your neighbor Frank already agreed to keep an eye on things," Victoria interrupted with a smile. "I asked him yesterday." James couldn't help but laugh. "You don't take no for an answer, do you?" "Not when it's the wrong answer," Victoria replied. "This is important, James. Being present for the premiere will amplify the impact of your story." Against his better judgment, James agreed. 3 weeks later, he and Lily found themselves in Chicago, being chauffeured to the NCN studios in a vehicle more luxurious than any he'd ever ridden in. Lily, initially overwhelmed by the bustling city and the attention they were receiving, quickly adapted with the resilience of youth, even managing to enjoy the experience. "Dad, do you realize how many people will see this?" she asked excitedly as they were escorted through the gleaming lobby of the network building. Victoria said American Heartland averages 3 million viewers per episode. The thought made James's stomach tighten. He'd agreed to the feature thinking it might generate some local interest or perhaps connect him with resources in the agricultural community. The reality of millions of strangers learning about his personal struggles was suddenly daunting. Victoria met them personally, looking very different from the bedraggled woman he'd pulled from floodwaters. In her professional environment, she radiated confidence and authority, yet she greeted them with the same warmth he remembered from their conversations on his farm. "Everything's prepared for the premiere viewing," she assured them, leading them to a conference room where several network executives waited. "After we watch the finished episode, we'll discuss next steps." "Next steps?" James questioned. Victoria smiled enigmatically. "Let's watch first." The lights dimmed, and the familiar opening sequence of American Heartland appeared on the large screen. Then came Victoria's voice, steady and compelling. "This week, we bring you the story of James Bennett, a fourth-generation farmer from Heartland County, Kentucky. His family has worked the same land for over a century, weathering economic depressions, changing markets, and increasingly extreme weather events. But when I met James Bennett, it wasn't in a carefully arranged interview, it was as he was pulling me from floodwaters that had engulfed my vehicle, risking his own life without hesitation." The episode unfolded as a masterfully crafted narrative, beginning with James's rescue of Victoria, but quickly expanding to tell the broader story of Bennett Farm's history, challenges, and uncertain future. The footage captured the beauty of the land alongside its vulnerabilities. James's quiet competence amid growing financial pressure, and Lily's determination to honor her family's legacy while pursuing her own dreams. Most powerful were the interviews, edited to highlight James's thoughtful perspective on agricultural sustainability, rural economic challenges, and the emotional toll of watching a generational business struggle to survive. Victoria's narration provided context and occasionally posed provocative questions, but the story belonged to James and Lily. When the lights came back up, James was speechless. The episode had portrayed them with dignity and nuance, neither glossing over their difficulties nor exploiting them for dramatic effect. It was, simply, the truth of their lives, presented with respect and insight. "That was," he began, then faltered, overcome with emotion. "Perfect," Lily finished for him, squeezing his hand. Victoria beamed. "I'm glad you approve. Now, about those next steps I mentioned." She gestured to one of the executives, who opened a folder and began distributing documents. "Mr. Bennett," the executive began, "even before the episode's public airing, we've received tremendous interest from several sectors. First, 3 agricultural technology companies have expressed interest in using your farm as a test site for climate-adaptive farming techniques. This would include financial compensation, as well as access to cutting-edge equipment and methodologies." James accepted the paperwork, stunned. "Test site? My farm?" "Your innovative water management approaches impress them," Victoria explained. "Despite limited resources, you've developed systems they believe could be enhanced and implemented more broadly." The executive continued. "Additionally, the State Agricultural Extension Office has selected Bennett Farm for their Rural Sustainability Partnership Program, which includes grant funding and technical support." As the man outlined more opportunities from educational partnerships to potential book projects, James struggled to process the sudden reversal of his fortunes. When the presentation concluded, the room fell silent, waiting for his response. "This is overwhelming," James finally said. "I never expected anything like this." "Your story resonated because it's authentic," Victoria said simply. "You weren't seeking attention or assistance. You were simply doing what generations of farmers have done, persevering against increasing odds, adapting to changing conditions, and maintaining your integrity throughout." In the days following the episode's public broadcast, the response exceeded even the network's expectations. Viewers across the country connected with James's story, many recognizing parallels to agricultural challenges in their own communities. Letters and emails poured in, some sharing similar experiences, others offering encouragement or practical suggestions. More significantly, concrete support materialized. A farm equipment manufacturer offered to replace James's aging tractor at a fraction of retail cost. A soil conservation nonprofit provided resources for restoring the flood-damaged fields. A regional grocery chain proposed a direct purchasing agreement for Bennett Farm's future harvests, guaranteeing a stable market. Perhaps most meaningful was the response from their local community. Neighbors who had been fighting their own parallel battles stepped forward with offers of labor, equipment sharing, and moral support. The isolating struggle that had characterized recent years gave way to renewed connection and collaboration. 6 months after the broadcast, as James stood surveying his western field now planted with a new drought-resistant wheat variety developed by one of the technology partners, he heard a car approaching. Victoria Reeves stepped out, looking relaxed in casual clothes, very different from her television persona. "I was in Kentucky for a follow-up story," she explained, "and thought I'd stop by to see how things are going." James gestured to the promising young wheat. "Better than they have in years. I can't thank you enough for what you did." Victoria shook her head. "I didn't do anything except shine a light on what was already here: a resilience, your knowledge, your commitment to this land." They walked the property together, James pointing out the improvements made possible by the partnerships formed after the broadcast. New irrigation systems, soil monitoring technology, and sustainable farming practices had transformed the operation. While Bennett Farm wasn't wealthy by any measure, it was now stable and forward-looking in a way it hadn't been for decades. "And Lily?" Victoria asked as they completed their tour. James smiled proudly. Starting at the State University in the fall. Agricultural science major. Says she wants to bring new research back to Bennett Farm. So there will be a fifth generation, Victoria observed. It appears so, James agreed. Though I've learned that preserving this place doesn't mean keeping everything the same. Adaptation isn't surrender, it's survival. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. That's a perspective many of our viewers connected with. Rural America isn't stubbornly clinging to the past, it's finding ways to honor tradition while embracing necessary change. As they reached the farmhouse, James asked a question that had been on his mind since the broadcast. Why did you choose me? There must be thousands of struggling farmers with stories similar to mine. Victoria considered the question. When you waded into that floodwater to save me, you didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate risks or rewards. You saw someone in trouble and acted. That same quality was evident in how you've approached every challenge. On this farm with immediate, purposeful action rather than complaint or despair. End quote. She paused, looking out over the field stretching to the horizon. But there was something else. Something I recognized only after spending time here. This land isn't just property to you, it's a relationship, one that's been nurtured through generations. That's increasingly rare in our transactional society, and I think people are hungry for that kind of connection and continuity. Before leaving, Victoria mentioned that the network was considering a follow-up episode, perhaps focusing on the implementation of sustainable practices at Bennett Farm and similar operations throughout the region. Would you be interested? She asked. James thought about the spotlight he'd never sought, the privacy he'd always valued, and weighed it against the tremendous positive changes that had resulted from sharing his story. Yes, he decided. If it helps other farmers find their way forward, then it's worth doing. As Victoria's car disappeared down the driveway, James remained on the porch, reflecting on the improbable chain of events that had begun with a dangerous rescue during a flash flood. His life had been transformed, not through random luck, but through a genuine human connection that had expanded outward, touching countless others. The sun was setting over fields that once again held promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, farming always did, but, for the first time in years, James faced the future with something beyond mere determination. He felt hope, rooted as deeply as the generations of Bennetts who had worked this land before him, and branching upward toward those who would continue long after he was gone. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering against spring in Kentucky, brought unpredictable weather. But this time, James wasn't facing the elements alone. The networks of support, both personal and professional, that had formed in recent months, created a resilience beyond what any individual could maintain. James checked the weather radar on his phone. Just a passing shower, nothing like the deluge that had nearly claimed Victoria's life and had threatened to be the final blow to Bennett Farm. Still, he made a mental note to inspect the new drainage systems afterward, always mindful that in farming, preparation was as important as reaction. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily, sharing her excitement about an agricultural scholarship interview she'd just completed. James smiled as he typed back his support. His daughter had blossomed in recent months, finding her own voice as she balanced her connection to the farm with her expanding horizons. As James prepared dinner that evening, he reflected on how quickly life could change. Just over 6 months ago, he'd been calculating how many more seasons Bennett Farm could survive before the bank foreclosed. Now, while not wealthy by any measure, they had stability, opportunity, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. The phone rang as he was setting the table. Frank from the neighboring property. James, you're not going to believe this, his neighbor began without preamble. Remember that abandoned Johnson place? The one that's been sitting empty since old Calvin passed? Sure, James replied, recalling the once productive 200 acres that had fallen into disrepair after its elderly bore. Owner died without heirs. The property had been tied up in legal complications for years. Well, it finally cleared probate. Some investment group from Louisville bought it. James felt a twinge of concern. Outside investors often meant development rather than continued agricultural use. They planning to build on it? That's the thing, Frank said, his voice animated. They're turning it back into working farmland. And get this, they're asking around for someone to manage it. Someone with experience in sustainable practices. The implication was clear, and James found himself speechless for a moment. You think they'd consider me? Hell, James. Half the county's talking about you since that TV show. You're the poster boy for innovative farming now. I already mentioned your name to their representative. After hanging up, James sat at his kitchen table, turning this unexpected development over in his mind. Managing additional acreage would be challenging, but it would also provide economies of scale that could make both properties more profitable. The thought of restoring abandoned farmland to productivity appealed to him. Deeply, it would be like turning back the tide that had been washing away family farms for decades. When Lily returned home that evening, they discussed the possibility together. Her practical questions impressed him about time management, equipment needs, and operational logistics. His daughter had been paying closer attention to the business side of farming than he'd realized. You'd need help, she observed. Real help. Not just me pitching in after school. James nodded. I've been thinking about that. If we take this on, we might be able to hire someone part-time. Maybe that Roberts boy who's been looking for work since the sawmill downsized. Lily seemed to approve of the idea, but then grew thoughtful. Dad, do you think all this would have happened without Victoria and that TV show? James considered the question seriously. Probably not, he admitted. We were running out of options. The flood might have been the final straw. It's strange, Lily mused. If her car hadn't stalled in that exact spot, if you hadn't heard her horn, if I'd evacuated when the emergency alert came through, James added with a wry smile. Exactly. Everything changed because of a random accident. James shook his head. I don't think it was the accident that changed things, Lily. It was what came after Victoria seeing something worth sharing in our story, people connecting with that story, and everyone involved choosing to build something positive from it. The following week, James met with representatives from the investment group. They were indeed looking for someone with local knowledge and commitment to sustainable practices to restore the Johnson property to productivity. The salary they offered was modest but fair, and came with performance incentives tied to crop yields and environmental metrics. James accepted the position, beginning a new chapter that would see Bennett Farm become a center for agricultural innovation in the region. Within 2 years, the operation had expanded to include educational programs for aspiring farmers, research partnerships with the state university, and a model for climate-adaptive farming practices. Throughout this transformation, James maintained regular contact with Victoria, who visited periodically to document the farm's evolution. What began as a professional relationship gradually developed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Victoria's perspective as an outsider with a keen eye for narrative helped James articulate the broader significance of what they were building at Bennett Farm. 3 years after their initial encounter in the floodwaters, Victoria approached James with a new proposal, a documentary series exploring agricultural resilience across America, with Bennett Farm as one of the dialogue central case studies. This more extensive project would require closer collaboration over an extended period. I'd understand if you've had enough of cameras and interviews, Victoria said, as they walked the flourishing fields that had once been underwater. You've more than fulfilled any obligation you might have felt. James considered the expanding scope of what Bennett Farm had become not just a family legacy, but a living laboratory for the future of rural America. I think there's still more of this story to tell, he said finally. And if telling it helps other farmers find their way forward, then my answer is yes. As production began on the new series, James often found himself thinking about the unpredictable chain of events that had led to this point. A flash flood that had initially seemed like one more disaster had instead become the catalyst for renewal, not just for his farm, but for the entire community that had rallied around it. In one of their on-camera conversations, Victoria asked James about this apparent paradox. Do you ever think about how different things might be if there hadn't been a flood that day? She inquired. If our paths hadn't crossed in such dramatic circumstances? James looked thoughtfully across the thriving fields before answering. I used to believe that success in farming was about controlling every variable: the soil, the weather, the market. But I've come to understand that there's wisdom in recognizing which elements we can control and which we can't. Sometimes the very events that seem most destructive create openings for new growth." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That flood destroyed my crops, but it also washed away some of my stubbornness, my isolation. It created space for new possibilities I wouldn't have considered otherwise." Victoria nodded appreciatively. "A philosophy that applies well beyond agriculture." "Exactly," James agreed. "We all face our own floods, those moments when what we've built seems to be washing away. The question isn't whether those moments will come, but how we respond when they do." As the cameras captured this exchange, Lily watched from nearby, her expression reflective. Now in her junior year of agricultural studies, she had developed her own vision for Bennett Farm's future, one that built upon her father's work while incorporating new scientific understanding and technological possibilities. That evening, after the film crew had departed, she approached James as he sat on the porch, his customary spot for end-of-day reflection. "Dad," she began, "I've been thinking about what you said today, about responding to challenges. It reminded me of that conversation we had right after the flood, when you wanted to save the farm without selling any land." James remembered it well, his resistance to the very idea of downsizing, his determination to preserve every acre regardless of economic reality. "I was pretty rigid back then," he acknowledged. "But you were right about one thing," Lily continued. "Your great-grandfather built something worth preserving. I just think maybe what needs preserving isn't the exact acreage or the specific crops, but the vision creating something sustainable that can be passed down through generations." James studied his daughter's face, seeing in it the perfect blend of Sarah's compassionate intelligence and the Bennett determination that had characterized his family for generations. "You've got some ideas brewing, don't you?" Lily smiled. "Several. Actually, I've been researching diversification strategies that could make us more resilient to both market fluctuations and climate events. And I've been talking with some classmates about forming a cooperative equipment sharing program for small farms in the county." End quote. As she outlined her thinking, James found himself both impressed by her practical insight and moved by her commitment to the principles that had guided Bennett Farm from its beginning. This, even more than the financial stability or the expanding operation, was the true measure of success. The knowledge that the values and vision would continue, adapted for new circumstances, but rooted in the same soil. When Victoria returned the following month to continue filming, she noticed the shift in dynamics immediately. "Something's different," she observed as James showed her the newest innovations in their irrigation system. "You seem lighter somehow." James considered this. "I suppose I am. For the first time in years, I'm not carrying the entire weight of this place on my shoulders." Lily's stepping into her role, bringing fresh ideas. The community partnerships are flourishing. It's not just about survival anymore, it's about growth. Victoria smiled. "That's what makes your story so compelling, James. It's not a simple tale of rescue, financial or otherwise. It's about rediscovering purpose and connection in an age when both seem increasingly rare." The documentary series, titled Rooted: Resilience in America's Heartland, premiered the following spring to critical acclaim and strong viewership. Its exploration of rural challenges and innovations resonated during a period of national reflection on sustainability and community interdependence. Bennett Farm, featured prominently throughout the series, became something of a pilgrimage site for agricultural students, sustainability advocates, and fellow farmers seeking inspiration. James adapted to this new role as reluctantly as he had to his initial television appearance, but with the same sense of larger purpose. If sharing their experience could help others navigate similar challenges, the occasional discomfort of public attention was a small price to pay. 5 years after the flood that had nearly destroyed Bennett Farm, James stood at the edge of his western field, watching a demonstration of a new drought-resistant corn variety, developed in partnership with the State University's Agricultural Extension Program. Beside him, Lily explained the technical aspects to a group of visiting farmers, her confidence and knowledge evident in every word. As the presentation concluded, and the visitors moved on to examine other innovations, Victoria approached, camera crew in tow. She had returned for a 5-year retrospective segment, documenting the remarkable transformation of both the farm and the broader community. "Ready for your interview?" she asked with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over years of collaboration. James nodded, though he still preferred working the land to talking about it. As they walked toward the pre-selected location, he asked, "Any particular angle you're focusing on for this segment?" "Legacy," Victoria replied. "How what began as one farmer's struggle to save his family land expanded into a model that's helping to reshape agricultural practices across the region." James considered this framing. "It's strange to think of myself as leaving any kind of legacy beyond this farm. I was just trying to keep the place afloat." "That's precisely why it worked," Victoria said. "Authentic purpose resonates in a way that calculated efforts never could. People recognized your genuine commitment to this land and the way of life it represents." The interview location Victoria had chosen was particularly meaningful. Exact spot along Willow Creek Road, where James had waded into floodwaters to rescue her years earlier. Now, instead of a raging torrent, the creek flowed peacefully within its banks, bordered by newly established wetland vegetation that served as both flood control and wildlife habitat. As the camera began rolling, Victoria opened with a reference to that pivotal day. 5 years ago, I sat in my car as floodwaters rose around me, certain I was facing my final moments. Then James Bennett appeared, risking his own safety to help a stranger. At the time, neither of us could have imagined that this crisis would become the catalyst for transformation, not just for Bennett Farm, but for agricultural practices throughout this region." End quote. She turned to James. "Looking back to that day, knowing what would follow, what goes through your mind?" James gazed thoughtfully at the now placid creek before answering. "I think about how close we all come, every day, to moments that can change everything. That flood could have been the end of Bennett Farm. The economics were already against us, and losing that season's crop should have been the final blow." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Instead, it became a beginning. Not because of any special wisdom or virtue on my part, but because it connected us to something larger than ourselves, to you, to viewers who responded to our story, to neighbors and partners who saw possibility where I was only seeing problems." "Would you say there's a lesson in that experience?" Victoria prompted. "Maybe several," James replied. "About the importance of community in an age of increasing isolation. About finding the courage to share our struggles instead of shouldering them alone. About seeing change not as an enemy of tradition, but as the means of preserving what matters most about it." As the interview continued, exploring the specific innovations and partnerships that had developed, James found himself reflecting on the profound shift in his own perspective over these 5 years. The farm that had once seemed like a burden, a responsibility he carried out of obligation to past generations, had become a source of purpose and connection that extended far beyond the Bennett family. When the camera stopped rolling, Victoria stayed behind as her crew packed up equipment. "You've become quite the philosopher farmer," she observed with a smile. James laughed. "Hardly. Just someone who's had the remarkable experience of watching his greatest challenge become his greatest opportunity." "Speaking of opportunities," Victoria said, her tone shifting slightly, "the network has approached me about expanding Rooted into an ongoing series, potentially with international elements exploring agricultural resilience globally. They'd like Bennett Farm to remain a central touchpoint, a place we return to regularly to ground the broader narrative." James considered the proposal. "That would be Lily's decision as much as mine now. She's increasingly taking the lead here." "I was hoping you'd say that," Victoria admitted. "I've already discussed it with her. She's enthusiastic, particularly about the educational potential." James nodded, unsurprised. His daughter had developed a natural affinity for translating complex agricultural concepts into accessible narratives, a skill that complemented his more hands-on approach. Together, they made an effective team for advocating sustainable farming practices. "Then I'd say you have your answer," he replied. "Though I warn you, she has ambitious plans for this place. Your cameras might have trouble keeping up." Victoria laughed. "I don't doubt it. She reminds me of someone else I know, determined, innovative, unwilling to accept that something can't be done just because it hasn't been done before. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, where the production team was gathering for a final briefing, Victoria added more seriously, "You know, in my line of work, I hear a lot of stories. Many are compelling, some are inspiring, but few have the kind of lasting impact I've seen here. What began as a human interest piece about a farmer saving a journalist has become a chronicle of rural revitalization." End quote. James reflected on this assessment. "I think that's because what's happening here isn't really about me, or even about Bennett Farm specifically. It's about rediscovering values that never actually disappeared: community, resilience, intergenerational knowledge, stewardship of the land. People respond to that because deep down, they're searching for those connections themselves." The sun was beginning to set as the production van departed, casting long shadows across fields that were once again productive. James stood on the porch, watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend in the road. So much had changed since that rain-soaked day when he'd heard a car horn through the downpour. The farm had been transformed, certainly. But so had he, from a man grimly fighting a losing battle alone to part of a vibrant network of innovation and support. Inside the farmhouse, he found Lily at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and her laptop cough, working on proposals for the next phase of their expansion. She looked up as he entered. "How did the interview go?" she asked. "Fine. Victoria mentioned the international series. You're on board with that?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "It's an amazing platform, Dad. We can share what we're learning with farmers facing similar challenges globally. And we can learn from their approaches too." James studied his daughter, recognizing in her the perfect blend of Bennett persistence and her own unique vision. "You know, when your great-great-grandfather started this farm, his whole world was these acres. Now you're talking about connections across continents." "But the core is still the same," Lily pointed out. "Taking care of the land so it can take care of people. That hasn't changed." James smiled, filled with a profound sense of satisfaction that transcended the day's challenges or the year's balance sheet. Bennett Farm had found its fifth generation, not through rigid adherence to past methods, but through thoughtful evolution guided by enduring principles. Later that evening, as James performed his final check of the propertier habit, formed through decades of farming life, he paused at the edge of the western field. The night was clear, stars spreading across the Kentucky sky in a display that generations of Bennetts had witnessed from this same vantage point. He thought about those predecessors, his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, men who had faced their own versions of the challenges he'd encountered. Each had found ways to adapt while preserving what mattered most. None could have anticipated the specific path the farm would take, just as he could never have imagined the transformative chain of events that began with a flash flood and a stranded motorist. The unpredictability that had once seemed farming's greatest liability now appeared in a different light as the very condition that made growth and renewal possible. Not growth merely in crops or acreage or profit margins, but in purpose and connection and understanding. From catastrophe had come opportunity. From isolation had come community. From near defeat had come renewal stronger than before. The story of Bennett Farm was still being written, its legacy continuing to unfold in ways James could only partially envision. But, for perhaps the first time since inheriting the property, he faced that uncertain future with genuine optimism rather than grim determination. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, where warm light spilled from the windows into the gathering darkness, James reflected that the true harvest of these difficult years wasn't measured in bushels or dollars. It was the restoration of hope, not just for Bennett Farm, but for the future of family farming itself and for the communities that had grown up around that way of life. Victoria had asked earlier about lessons learned from their journey. Perhaps the most important was this, that even in an age of increasing complexity and seemingly insurmountable challenges, individual stories and connections still mattered. One farmer's struggle, one journalist's interests, one community's response. These seemingly small elements could combine to create ripples of change that extended far beyond their origin point. The Bennett Farm would never be what it had been in previous generations. But perhaps it was becoming something more vital, For the current age, just a production site, but a nexus of innovation, education, and community resilience. Not a relic of the past, but a laboratory for the future of rural life. As James reached the porch, he heard Lily's voice from inside, apparently out of video call with university colleagues discussing some new research initiative. Her enthusiasm was evident, even through the partially open window. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring in farming always brought challenges. The Bennett legacy was in capable hands. James paused before entering, taking a moment to appreciate the full circle of their journey. 5 years ago, he had stood on this same porch, watching floodwaters threaten everything he'd worked for, convinced he was witnessing the beginning of the end for Bennett Farm. Now those same fields flourished under innovative management, the farmhouse buzzed with plans and partnerships, and the future stretched before them rich with possibility. The greatest flood in county memory, the disaster that should have been their undoing, had, instead, become the watershed moment that redirected their course. And the chance encounter with a stranded journalist had opened connections to a world beyond their fences, transforming isolation into community at precisely the moment it was most needed. As James finally stepped inside, closing the door on the night, he carried with him the profound understanding that had emerged from these years of change. That true resilience comes not from resistance to transformation, but from the wisdom to discern which changes to embrace and which traditions to preserve. It was a lesson as old as farming itself, yet one each generation had to discover anew as they worked the same soil under ever-changing skies. Bennett Farm would continue, though perhaps not as any of its founders could have imagined. And in that continuation, adaptive, communal, purposeful, lay the truest honor to all those who had tended these acres before, and all who would inherit them in the years to come.